What I wanted to do is, what we wanted to do is leave this last half hour or so just more for discussion and brainstorming on what the application of these results would be to forest management, and say, okay, given these are still preliminary results, but we have learned quite a lot at this point in time, so what we wanted to do is put out our ideas and, more importantly, hear from the attendees here in terms of what they think we can learn from this and how we can apply it to forest management. Now that we're looking at a situation where we have quite a few post-MPB stands in Alberta and are really coming to the point where we need to think about how we're going to manage those in some ways, and what can we learn from this and apply it to adaptive management going into the future. So what I have here is just sort of some real quick take-homes, and then my own kind of, or our own brainstorm kind of ideas about what the management implications are of our findings, and I'll just go through those quickly and then open it up, and really, rather than me talking, I want to hear from everybody in the audience, questions or comments or suggestions of where we go from here. So real quick summary of some of the take-homes. In the short term, what we found out is that 100% attacked stands are going to produce more water because of reduced evapotranspiration. But the MPB attack stands, or our simulated MPB attack stands, won't produce as much water as salvage log stands, because the salvage log stands are missing the canopy interception. So while those trees are standing, they're still going to have that canopy intercepting the precipitation with the needles, and even when the needles fall, there'll still be some interception of the precipitation by the standing trees. So it's going to be different than a salvage log situation. The partially attacked stands don't produce more water, or don't produce much more water. It seems because the remaining live trees can compensate. So they can take up the additional water that becomes available in the soil and ramp up their evapotranspiration in response to that. So maybe stands that are only partially attacked really won't have much, if any, net effect on soil water or on production of water from these affected areas. So what are the management implications of this? First one is that really to assess what the hydrologic risk of mountain pine beetle is that we need to assess it in the context of the timing and extent of attack across the landscape. So what is the lag timing? Is the attack sort of gradually over a few years, so that, or is it in one watershed or one large area, mass attack in a very short period of time? Those are going to have very different implications, and obviously the more concentrated in space and time the attack is, the more dramatic will be the potential risks and effects in terms of the hydrology. We need to understand and recognize the additional impact of salvage harvesting. So to the extent that the management decision is to salvage harvest these areas, we're going to see the hydrologic impacts that we already know exist in a log stand, and that those are more than in an MPB attacked stand. So we need to consider that when the decision is made to salvage harvest, that there is going to be that impact. And there needs to be an overall landscape a consideration of the overall landscape disturbance. So if we're looking at the watershed scale and thinking about what the risks and the potential hydrologic implications are, we need to look at that entire landscape and see, how much was harvested previously, how much are we planning to harvest now as a green harvest or a salvage log harvest, how much is affected by mountain pine beetle, and put that all together in a spatial way, and looking at what the climate scenarios might be, and use that to assess what the potential risk might be in terms of the hydrology. And as Pablo showed, is that there's likely going to be bigger effects in wetter years or wetter regions. So areas where there's more water, or in a year where there's more water than average, then the impacts in terms of mountain pine beetle or harvesting will be greater. In terms of the understory vegetation below ground stuff, in the short term we found that the understory vegetation seems to be quite resistant to the initial changes anyways in the soil moisture. There's evidence of some release of below ground resources, some additional water in the soil anyways, it seems. No change in the light, and the understory really hasn't changed much. The below ground processes in the microbial community seem to be fairly resistant as well to any of these short-term responses. And the probability of natural regeneration seems low. So probably largely due to a lack of microsites, but even where there were potentially good microsites, perhaps it's the light that becomes limiting, and so the opportunities for natural regeneration in these stands in the short term is pretty poor. And that's assuming that we have a seed fall, and that's another issue that we were monitoring these trees to see if the cones open, and there have been previous studies that showed that cones on standing dead mountain pine beetle attack lodgepole pine do open over time, so there's the possibility to have a natural seed cast in these stands over time, and we'll look at what happens to our trees in that regard. So there's possibility for seeds in the future, so the question then is, will they find a place that they can germinate and survive? So the management implications of this is that if sites aren't going to be salvage logged, then we need to look for opportunities to facilitate regeneration or natural regeneration in attacked stands. This could be done potentially through creating microsites, so I don't know, you can tell me if it's a possibility to look at doing some site preparation in these stands and try and create some microsites so that when the cones start to open, that, or maybe we can find how many years down the road before the cones start opening. We're also monitoring that in the Foothills Growth and Yield project as well, so we're looking at whether the cones are opening in NPB attacked trees. And you could think about going in and creating some microsites to maybe, without too great expense, encourage some natural regeneration. Or could we look at partially harvesting these stands to open the canopy and look at what level of canopy opening we would need to create a light environment that would be good for natural regeneration? Could we seed these stands if the cones don't open, or if there's not sufficient natural seed cast? Or could we plant these stands or partially harvest them and plant them? And then if we're going to plant them, do we want to plant them with pine? Or could we look at planting shade-tolerant species in these stands that are probably much more likely to be able to survive with some extent of the canopy remaining? So these are questions that I'd like to discuss. Other management implications, I think it's important to think about different management options for partially attacked stands. And I don't, maybe you guys know, I don't know how much of the stands that we have in Alberta would be considered in this category of partially attacked, or at this stage they seem to be partially attacked. And so we know that they seem to be resistant in terms of the hydrology. So I think they need to be considered differently in terms of what we might do. And is MPB really a surrogate for thinning? Might the remaining live trees compensate in terms of the evapotranspiration? Could they show release growth? Could they grow in much the way that we might expect the retained trees in a partially harvested or thin stand to grow? And is that a model that you might want to look at in terms of what the implications will be for the future yield of these stands if we just left them alone? The increased soil moisture, I think, is really interesting, and you know, my question is, could it be a benefit in terms of regeneration? If we do have increased soil moisture and create the right microsites, then that could actually be quite nice. Moisture is often limiting in these microsites for seeds to regenerate, and so in attacked stands, if there is increased soil moisture and you create the microsites, it could actually have potentially a beneficial effect. Longer term impacts, of course, we want to keep monitoring and looking at these sites over time, and perhaps, you know, we're at a stage where we could start making some comparisons to naturally MPB attacked stands. That might be an interesting complement to the project, to start looking at verifying some of these in natural stands. The question, of course, is if the understory and any trees that are regenerating, can it compensate for the loss of the canopy in terms of evapotranspiration? So over what time period will we see hydrologic recovery or rebalance of the water balance in these stands as other components of the vegetation compensate for the loss of the canopy? As we go towards the gray attack stage, canopy interception is going to decline. We know that for sure. And what will be compensating for that? So could the understory compensate for that? As Pablo said, we know relatively little about kind of important role that the forest floor and the understory vegetation plays in interception of precipitation, and we don't know to what extent it might be able to compensate, and maybe interception won't change that much, or if it's not able to compensate, then interception will decline, and we're going to see more of effect in terms of the increased soil moisture. And of course, in the longer term, it'd be nice to see some empirical verification of the model results. So Pablo's modeling results suggest that as we get to a grade attack stage, we're going to see some pretty substantive hydrologic impacts in these stands. And so it would be nice to be able to validate in some way in our own stands, and perhaps in some MPV attack stands, whether in fact we're actually starting to see those kinds of impacts. In the longer term, how will the understory community respond? Will we see these species differential effects? How long will those be? How much inertia is there in that understory plant community? And how long and to what extent we'll see responses as the light begins to increase and the below ground resources increase as well. And as that understory community changes, that's going to have huge impacts for the stand successional development. So if we don't get disturbances and things to assist with regeneration of trees in the understory, what will happen to these stands? Can we get, a really abundant and I don't know what the right word is, because I don't want to use a word that's negative, and I wouldn't like to use a negative word about understory vegetation. But in terms of the impacts on potential regeneration, you could get a situation where the understory vegetation is basically monopolizing all the space and really inhibiting the stand from moving forward and regenerating itself again to a forest. So it could change the stand successional development, hamper conifer regeneration. And then, of course, the question of the fire hazard, the implications of the downwoody debris. As we start to get blowdown, it'll be interesting to know what the timing and the dynamics of the blowdown or the fall down of the dead trees is here in Alberta compared to what Kathy Lewis was talking about. I don't know. I kind of suspect that ours might be a little more prone to blowdown, or that those sites might be a little more prone to blowdown. They tend to be shallow rooted, those trees, and so as that woody debris accumulates, then of course there's implications for fire hazard, and we have to think about what fuels are and what the moisture is. If we have increasing soil moisture and moisture in those fine fuels on the forest floor, maybe it's not such a concern that we get the large dead wood, or as it falls down and you start to get a lot more just evaporation from the site, then the surface fuels and the wood may dry out quite a bit, and then you could have probably some really serious implications for fire hazard for these sites.